Okay, well, welcome back for another round of Q&A. You'll have to excuse my voice. I'm just getting it back actually, so bear with me on that. But this week we have quite a few questions surrounding worries once you get started. The doubts start to creep in from others and your own personal doubts. And I think one of the big ones that is on the list today is this idea of how do I know that my child isn't falling behind of where they should be? And I know that as a parent, you wonder that, like, man, do they know everything that they should? And you especially, though, hear it from the skeptics on the outside, maybe onlooking family members or friends that are like, how do you know that they're getting everything they need, especially if you're not following a super regimented, um, curriculum or schedule like the school system? I think a lot of that might be self-imposed or imposed by the school system. This idea even of like who even decided what my 6-year-old ought to know half,
Right.
halfway through his first year of school, right? So what would you say to that person from a technical standpoint of if there is an answer of how can they actually measure if their kids where they should be, and also maybe just ease their minds on not worrying so much about it to begin with because maybe it doesn't matter as much as we think.
Yeah. Good question. It's a packed question. And obviously I would conjecture that um, we have artificial standards that have been created. If anybody wants to do the research behind how school was created the way it works today, we went from a one schoolhouse setting where all grades were taught together from roughly children back in the day before we had the school system set up the way it is now in buildings where we have grades K through 12. It was a one house school system that was roughly your child started around 8 years old, graduated by about 14. And and the kids that did go to school would go during the off season, winter, not the harvest season, right? They would be pulled home for work.
Yeah.
And so um anyway, I would highly encourage that if you're going to commit yourself to the homeschool life, that you maybe do some digging and some research about how the school system was created. The way it was created today was so that fathers could go to war, mothers could go to work, the state could take charge of your child and indoctrinate them with whatever they wanted to create factory workers and people who didn't question anything. So maybe look into that first of all. Um, but if you want a little, it is a scary decision to make because we have been conditioned as a society that this is what it looks like. These are the subjects that are most important. These are the subjects that are going to make your children successful. And someone came up with that. And if you kind of delve into who came up with it, you might not be as inclined to follow it. But it is still scary. So if you really feel like your child might be falling behind, at least with the system or in your state, one simple thing to do is look at your state standards. And again, going back to that HSLDA, some states have requirements. And so you might have to follow those requirements as a homeschooler in your state. I think you can still give them a more organic experience with their learning of those subjects. But you can always take a look at your state standards. They do vary from state to state. We've tried in government to make it more of an across the board standards that work for every state so that if your child moves, say from what you're learning in the Midwest might be totally different than what you're learning on the East Coast. So they've tried to standardize that a little bit. If you want a little bit of a more broad understanding of what your child should know, um, that would still follow some standards but be a little more general, there's a series written by E.D. Hirsch that's called What Your Kindergartner Needs to Know, What Your Fifth Grader Needs to Know. It's the core knowledge series. So if you want something more to go by as a guide, those are two suggestions. I would still highly recommend, after 20 years of homeschooling, that you question who made these standards? Where are they coming from? Why do we hold math and sciences up here and act like art and music and everything don't matter? Um, Anything that you find in the system that is deemed worthy of learning for your child is to get them to pass tests, which make the school money, which get you into college, which make the school money, which throw you into a workforce that, according to Mike Rowe, who is the host of Dirty Jobs on TV. I don't actually know if it's still on, but I was watching an interview with him the other day. It was from 7 years ago. 50% of kids coming out 7 years ago were unemployed with degrees. And then another 50% of those kids, their jobs didn't even require a degree. So really question what the purpose behind your child's education is.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like they would have any ulterior motives at all to me.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. Questioning the status quo or the perceived status quo is definitely easier said than done. Just an experience to share to maybe help with that. I have three kids, and my two boys are just 15 months apart, and they're very different, completely different
Oh,
personality.
yeah.
And it's just super obvious to me already that they're going to be learning different things at different rates and be interested in different things at different times. And it is much more natural to let that happen within reason at their
Yeah.
timing and at their pace so that you're not fighting them to get them to learn something that they're not even ready for. The reality is, like, if you have a kid that just can't stand reading and you just back off a little bit for a while, when they get into it, and they will, if you're patient and you keep reading out loud, do all the other things we talk about. If you're patient and you wait for them to get into it themselves, they'll accomplish in 6 months what
Yes.
you would have accomplished in 2 years of dragging them along,
Mhm.
kicking and screaming. And so there's no real urgency to following exactly the standards and the standardized tests that are provided by the public schools. And especially if it's just going to slow your kids' learning process. Let them do things they enjoy and are interested in. Try and help them be interested in all the things that you feel are important. If they're just really fighting you back on something, just just back off it for a while. Would you agree with that?
Right. Yes, absolutely. I've experienced it. Again, I've gone through 7 children, all very different. I pulled one child out of school because I felt like they were falling behind a little bit. I pulled another child out because she was ahead and she was bored. My two cabooses are boys back to back that have completely different learning styles, learn at different rates, interested in different things. And yeah, you not only stunt their ability to learn, but you really stifle their love of learning. You just kill it. And we don't want to do that. We want to foster that.
And not to be a dead horse, but one more thought on this is, like, it's almost like we get embarrassed as parents that our kids
Mm-hmm.
not perform where they should be. But eventually, if it's something that's really important, the child will get embarrassed. They'll be in a
Yes.
setting where they're
Well,
asked to read something and it's like, oh man,
that's true.
I need to work on my reading. Or they'll have to do some mental math and it'll be awkward. And that might be the thing that spurs them to learn. But the point is, I'm not saying if your kid doesn't want to learn something, just completely drop it. But
Right.
it's okay to let it happen at their timing, and you'd be surprised the accelerated growth that can happen and the accelerated learning that can happen once they're finally wanting to do it themselves. You'll
Yeah.
accomplish what you need to
It's so
accomplish
true.
within the time.
And yeah, not to extend this topic necessarily, but I was talking to Alyssa, your wife, the other day, just reminding her again as she's delving into teaching reading to Crew, that who's 5 years old, that there was a study done years ago, and a teacher that I admire wrote a book about it. She is actually an advocate for homeschool parents, and they did this experiment where they took kindergartners and they spent 3 years immersing these kindergartners in a reading program. And another set They didn't do a formal reading program and immersed them just in science. After 3 years, they found by third grade that the children that were immersed in the science program were actually better readers than the children that were immersed in the reading program, because they had been exposed to a larger vocabulary, broader ideas. And when it was time for them to learn how to read, they actually had better context and understanding, and so comprehension. So they actually learned how to read faster. And so, yeah, we've put these artificial
It's so funny.
stipulations up.
It's just so funny that
And
we stress over it too. Like we
yeah,
believe it that much. It's like you
yeah,
have a legitimately interested, family member or third party that's genuinely concerned. Are they getting everything they need? And it's
yes,
based on what? Yes,
exactly.
they're thriving intellectually, emotionally, and physically, and that's all you can ask for. I don't want
Yeah,
to oversimplify it, but uh, we shouldn't overcomplicate it either. So
right.
I think
Yeah,
that's really good. So yeah, there's a couple resources for you if you really want to get a good gauge, but overall, question question the
yes,
standard, and don't be afraid to let your child learn at their pace, and stand back and be amazed at how quickly they'll learn when they're
yeah,
ready. So
yeah.
that's good. Well, that kind of leads us into our next point, which is, and we kind of touched on this, but like, how about testing at home or tracking intellectual progression? Because we don't want to mimic the school system exactly verbatim, but does there need to be any of that for me as a parent with my homeschool child? Like, do we need to be checking in, taking any kind of standardized tests or otherwise to see where they're at and that they are actually learning? So we want to make sure
Right.
they're learning something.
Yeah. Well, let's obviously hope that you as a parent are spending enough time with them that you know what's going on, right? Now, again, there are states that require testing. Our state, Utah, is an opt-out test state. I have chosen to opt out because I literally teach and sit with and discuss and question and observe my children every single day. I know where they're at. Once in a while, in fact, when I had all 7 children at home, one of the most useful tools for me was to have about a quarterly interview with my children where we just kind of go over, what do you feel like you're lacking? Where do you feel like you need a skill? This goes back to our CTR that we've talked about in another thing. Do you have a tool or a skill that you're missing that is keeping you from moving on and progressing to the next step? And so for me, I don't feel like we need to do testing. My kids have done math books that have, a test after a couple of chapters. Fine. And we see how they're doing. Sometimes for fun, we'd give them hey, everybody, we're going to get together and do a spelling bee. And I'd give them words to spell. And they more thought it was fun than me actually testing where they're at. If I'm looking at their work, if I'm having conversations with them, I can tell if they're comprehending things. I can tell if there's a gap in their math. And then we just sit down and we make some goals and plan how we can maybe fill in that gap. And sometimes maybe they don't recognize a gap and I recognize the gap. And so we'll talk about that. And I don't see a purpose in testing. It's not really a good indicator usually, especially for children who don't test well. And you know, as I was preparing for this call today, I had just read this week. I usually tend to read something to reignite my fire for homeschool because, believe it or not, even after 20 years, I still need to be reignited and reminded of why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I was looking at the Hebrew versus the Greek model of education. And the Greek model was that your child is basically a brain to be filled up with knowledge. And the Hebrew model is to become like your teacher. And so we hope that we're modeling what we want our children to learn, what we want our children to be. And the Hebrew model is about becoming, and it's very principle based and about loving and teaching by example. Whereas the Greek model is your child's literally this thing to just be filled up and regurgitate and parrot back what they've learned. And so we have to ask, is that real learning? And is that the kind of education we want our children to have? Do we just want them to parrot back whatever we've taught them? And so again, I would ask, we need to be questioning, what are we teaching? Why are we teaching it? I would even ask, like, what intellectual prowess did you gain or acquire from your own school experience? And honestly, I cannot name one thing I gained from mine other than learning how to play the viola. And that was because I wanted to. I learned that in school. My parents didn't have money for private lessons. Other than that, I cannot think of a skill that I acquired at school. And
Yeah.
if we aren't acquiring those skills, why are we sending them into an environment where they're going to come out after 12 to 18 years of education and go, I'm afraid to teach my child how to read? Then what did you really learn in the end, you know?
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is test if you want to,
Yeah.
or if it's required, but definitely not a requirement for a successful education, for a successful
No.
homeschool experience, especially if you're involved as a parent and you're modeling and being involved in the learning and the teaching.
Yes.
Because, yeah, if you slap a curriculum down in front of your kid and walk away or shut the door all day, you might need some additional forms of measuring their progress. But the way you do it in particular, and
Yeah.
hopefully everyone can get to that point, is you're with them and you can see the learning happening. You said something, I'm just gonna follow up on. It can be a brief answer, but we hear it a lot. You mentioned people that don't test well. There's a comedian who joked, you get these people that say they don't test well. Oh, you mean you're stupid? So what do you mean by that? Not testing well? Like, just because isn't a test supposed to measure how well you've learned? So let's
How well you, I would say, memorized, because a lot of times tests are geared toward a specific type of learner, which is the memorization learner in general. It doesn't, we're humans. We have this depth and complexity to us. We have a whole person. What does the person actually understand? Who are they becoming? What skills have they acquired? A lot of times those tests don't measure skills or your EQ. We're so into IQ, but what about our EQ? And so I don't think a test fully gives us a full picture of what the whole child is becoming. They just measure, okay, did you memorize this bit of information, and then can you spit it back out? And even for those who do test well, generally, unless they're going into a career that they're pursuing, like medical school, a lawyer, there are some careers that need memorization skills. You need to have quick recall. But a lot of times you just hear people, yeah, I just memorized it for the test and then I forgot all about it. So is that real learning taking place? I just, not to be too long, but we knew a kid when we lived in Virginia that was in our homeschool group, and he was 5. This kid had every state and country memorized. And it wasn't because he was being tested or had some geography class at 5 years old. This kid was just fascinated with maps and just loved knowing where things were on the map. And he could regurgitate and tell you where every state was. And he was passionate about it, and he was accurate, and he was good. But he did it because he loved it, not because someone was forcing him to do it. And so there's just a really different outcome with when you teach to a test and when you teach to create a person and who they're becoming. So,
I think too that's going to become more important the more Hebrew style of learning for as we really enter this era of artificial intelligence, because
yes.
it's a big brain that can retain all the information in the world is AI. And so the ability to have incredible recall, I'm not saying it's not cool or not important or not useful, but it's going to become a lot less demanded, really speak.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
anyway, just another thought.
it
Cool.
is.
Well, okay, that's testing. What about curriculum? Do I need a curriculum? And why or why not? And if so, how do I go about choosing the right one for my kid?
Okay. So, do you need a curriculum? Depends on what you're doing. Um, I will say that coming right out of starting homeschool with, I think she was 9 when I pulled my oldest out of school. I was a high school graduate. I did not go to college. I was terrified, like absolutely terrified that I didn't know enough. And in hindsight, again, I'm thinking it's been a crazy journey to me. And it's been a journey because the people I've interacted with throughout the years, it's always interesting. People say, well, you're going to need that. You're going to need that high school diploma and you're going to need that bachelor's degree. And I have not had interactions with people where the first thing we talk about is, oh, yeah, so what was your GPA? Did you get a high school diploma? Did you get a college degree? Nobody's ever asked me that. Now, when I was first married, there were times when people maybe got into discussions, oh, where'd you go to college? And they'd connect on, oh, we went to the same college or whatever. But that's just an artificial experience. And what has fascinated me, and I still find this kind of interesting to this day, is how many times I've had people come up to me, especially in the past 5 years, and just say, you're so smart. I'm so intimidated because you just know so much. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying it because it still is a shock to me that they think I'm smart and I didn't get the degree and they did. And it's doesn't have to do with being smart. It has to do with being a good learner and continuing to learn. And I've noticed people put a gap on their learning and they go, okay, I graduated high school or I graduated college. I'm done. I've arrived. And you've never arrived. We have our whole life to learn. And so going back to curriculum, I I was very intimidated and I started with curriculums and I started mimicking the school system. And you can do that. And there again are some states that are going to require more than other states, and I think there are ways around that, but that can be a different discussion. So if you're looking to literally just teach your child, here's a curriculum I've chosen with science or with grammar, and I'm going to teach this to my child. You're teaching the curriculum. You're not teaching to the child. So it can be very intimidating, but I personally don't think you need as many curriculums as you think. In fact, the longer I've gone, the more curriculums I've gotten rid of or opted out of. And it's because primarily you 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 create this, what do I feel is important for my child to learn? And you can just look at today's society. Does your kid need to know the multiplication facts and the grammar to the upteenth degree? Is someone sitting there parsing all of your sentences while you're speaking? I mean, I just think about the skills that are needed today. Again, going back to that Mike Rowe with the dirty jobs, he talked about how as a society we've chosen to hold up the educational system through the university as the model of the ultimate education, while neglecting the skill based and the stuff that makes our entire daily experience even worth living and workable and fixable. And we've ignored the trade side, and we've kind of downplayed it, as if he talks about in this video how we've kind of gone, well, if you can't do higher education, you're not smart enough for that, you can do the trade work. And that isn't true. That's a lie we've been sold. And so I would look at, in fact, trade is getting to the point where a lot of trades are getting paid more than a college degree worker. And so you need to just look at what skills does my child need and then create your curriculum around that. And that could probably be its own video. But if you are going to choose a curriculum, I would choose something much more open-ended. There are curriculums out there that are scripted, and I started with that. And it is the most unnatural feeling experience when you open a book and read to your child, right now, we're going to do math and we're going to talk about shapes. We're going to talk about four-sided shapes. Okay. It's just such a weird experience. And I know that at first some people might need that crutch to kind of get going. But once, I would highly recommend that if you're on the fence about curriculum or not, to get a book, get a great book. I'll take Farmer Boy, for example. My boys and I read Farmer Boy every year. This will be our fourth year reading it. And wow, what you can learn from that book. You can learn about weather patterns, farming, economics, baking, how the country used to be, history, the railroad, when it came into existence, how they used to dye wool, how to shear sheep, what even the political landscape looked like at that time period, how much it's changed. Like, there is so much you can pull out of a book that if I were to do any curriculum, that is now what I tend to lean toward. As children get older, you might want more formal curriculum for things like sciences and stuff, and that would be more based on your child's interest. If this one isn't really a short answer because there's so many facets to it, but that's kind of my overall thought on that. Hopefully it wasn't too all over the place.
No, that's good advice. I think in summary, what I'm hearing is a curriculum can be a good transition, especially for someone that's new to it, as long as it's an open-ended curriculum and it's not too regimented and it fits your child's needs. But overall, we should be striving to get to a point where we can evaluate the world that our children are growing up in and them and their interests, and connect the dots basically between what are the skills they're going to need and what are they interested in. And the perfect curriculum is probably somewhere in there. And
Yeah.
it goes back to, again, this idea that it's all about the skills you learn more than it is about the information you can regurgitate,
Right.
which is what most curriculums are going to focus on because that's what curriculums are for.
Yes.
And so, um, if there is a curriculum being used in the interim for someone that's just starting, can you rattle off a couple of just quick suggestions of good places to start?
Yeah. So I think that for anything in the elementary level and below, like, preschool through roughly eighth grade, I would look into Five in a Row, fiveinarow.com, playfulpioneers.com. Those are both literature-based curriculums where they will teach you. And I think they're really great for someone who does need a little hand holding at first, because they will teach you to take a book and extrapolate. So again, just go back to thinking about what our country was founded on. We're dumber as a society today than we were. We think of the old Hicks and the pioneers and think maybe they weren't as smart because they didn't have all this modern technology and advances, but they used to read. The primary way of learning was reading, discussing, reading, discussing, writing, reading, discussing, writing. It was just this thing that went in a big circle, and we've kind of just done away with it. And it was people who wanted to take portions of the learning and break it down into these bite-sized pieces so that they could sell curriculum, so they could teach things younger. You don't need to teach a second grader grammar. Wait until they're 13, 15, and they'll get it way faster. They won't hate it. They'll understand it. It's an abstract concept. It's just, there's just a lot of things we throw in that just doesn't need to be there early on. So those would be the two. Now, if you're looking at something for older grades, that's a little harder. There isn't as much out there. So I would still recommend even if you're starting older, to maybe try something in the oldest level of five in a row, and just try it out and get the idea of what it's like, and then just take great books. And again, that's a whole nother podcast, but um, books that you recommend. I don't agree with the philosophy of read for the sake of reading. I think always be thinking to introduce our children to the greatest good, the greatest value, the most excellent quality art, poetry, literature. We don't want to just be throwing whatever at our kids, but that's a whole nother discussion. So there's my recommendations for that.
Awesome. Perfect. No, and hopefully that helps. I think overall, in summary for today, don't worry about your child falling behind. It,
Yeah.
if you're involved and you're trying and you're actively reading and doing all the other things, it would be pretty hard for that to actually happen. Plus, we've established, I think, what are they really falling behind from,
Right.
right? So question the standard. And if you want to check with your child's progress, there's a couple of resources out there. But and we came full circle because even in the curriculum thing, you mentioned not teaching grammar too early. So again, let your child learn at their pace, uh, and they'll learn way faster as they come across those subjects. They won't need 4 years to learn grammar if they're actually
Right.
ready to learn grammar. It doesn't take
Yeah.
that, and so there's that. And then when it comes to testing, test if you want, but the ultimate test is your daily interaction with your child. And if you're doing it right, you should have that. You should have daily interactions, and those interactions are also going to serve as the basis for your curriculum ultimately. That
Yeah.
constant evaluation of your child and the world they're growing up in. I love that. Like, it's such a practical approach, and yet it also is so personalized, but it should be. Like, there's no way that a public education system can adapt and change and
No.
modify to the needs of a child and the needs of a changing world the way that a parent can who's doing with their kid. And so trust that, trust yourself. And if you need a curriculum in the interim, we have a couple of suggestions. We'll put them in the description. But overall, you got this, and your kid has this, and just let your kid learn, create an environment
Yeah.
where they want to learn, and they'll be they'll be rock stars. They'll have no problem going out there and making a life for themselves in the world full of products of a system that's failed anyway, to put it blunt.
Yep. So true.
Right on. Well, that
Yeah.
wraps it up for today, guys. If you have any questions, just drop them in the chat or drop them in the comments, and we'll do our best to answer them as they come. So good luck on
Hey,
homeschool journey, and we'll see you in the next one.
thanks.
Thanks, Mom.
See ya.